Aircraft's avionics and control systems, they could manipulate inputs to make the plane behave unpredictably, even to the point of forcing a nosedive. However, modern aircraft have multiple safeguards, including manual overrides and redundancy in flight control systems, to prevent external interference. For something like a Learjet, which relies on autopilot and avionics, an attack would need to either spoof sensor data, tricking the aircraft into thinking it's at the wrong altitude or orientation, or take direct control of flight surfaces. Yes, in theory, an AI-driven exploit in a Black Hawk helicopter's avionics could manipulate sensor data to mislead the pilot about their actual altitude or position. If someone with inside access embedded a hardware or firmware level backdoor, it could activate after a certain date, such as after the Lunar New Year, and systematically alter key flight system. Yes, a Learjet in a steep, high-speed dive could resemble a missile in certain conditions. If the aircraft were pushed to its maximum speed, then forced into a near-vertical nosedive, it could reach extremely high velocities, especially if the engines were still providing thrust. Learjets can fly at speeds over 500 miles per hour in normal cruise, and in a full-power dive, they could exceed that. At terminal velocity, with the right angle and control surface settings, it could create a missile-like trajectory. Depending on its altitude when the dive starts, it might even create a sonic boom if it approaches the speed of sound. From the ground, a fast-moving jet in freefall with its engines running could look very similar to a missile, especially at a distance or on radar. The shape wouldn't be identical, but the speed, heat signature, and descent angle could make it appear that way. Yes, if an AI or a hardware exploit took control of a Learjet's avionics and flight systems, it could force the jet into a full-throttle nosedive with little to no chance of pilot recovery. The main ways this could be done. 1. Autopilot exploit. If the AI or malware manipulated the autopilot system, it could command maximum thrust and a steep dive while locking out manual overrides. 2. Sensor spoofing. If the altitude, attitude, or airspeed indicators were altered, the pilots might not realize they were in a dive until it was too late. 3. Flight control hijacking. On modern aircraft with electronic flight controls, a deep enough exploit could override pilot inputs and force the plane to remain in a dive. 4. Engine and thrust manipulation. If the AI controlled engine power, it could push the jet to its max speed before initiating the dive, making it even more deadly. In a worst-case scenario, if the AI had control, and the system was designed to ignore pilot intervention, the jet could accelerate to speeds where structural failure occurs before impact. If a Learjet were forced into a high-speed dive past its structural limits, you might see signs of failure, but not necessarily flames coming from the engines unless something catastrophic happened. Here's what could happen. 1. Airframe stress and breakup. The faster the jet goes, the more aerodynamic forces build up. If it exceeds its design limits, parts of the aircraft, like wings or control surfaces, could start to break apart. This could create debris that might look like sparks or flashes. 2. Engine overload. If the AI or malware forced the engines to run at maximum power beyond safe limits, they could overheat and possibly fail, leading to smoke, flame, or even an engine explosion in extreme cases. 3. Friction heating. At extreme speeds, the air resistance alone could heat parts of the fuselage. While this wouldn't usually cause visible flames, it could create a glowing effect on leading edges if the jet approached transonic speeds. 4. Fuel or hydraulic system rupture. If the structure failed in a way that ruptured fuel lines or hydraulic systems, leaking fuel could ignite, making it look like the plane was on fire before impact. From the ground, a Learjet in a terminal dive with pieces breaking off could look like a missile with a trail, especially if debris or fuel ignites. Yes, if a fully fueled Learjet were forced into a high-speed nosedive and crashed into the ground, it would likely result in a massive explosion. The severity of the explosion would depend on factors like speed, angle of impact, and what it crashed into. At full throttle and maximum dive speed, the kinetic energy alone would be devastating. If the fuel tanks remain mostly intact until impact, the crash could cause a fireball as the jet's fuel ignites instantly. The explosion would be even more intense if the plane struck a hard surface like concrete or rock, compressing the fuel and increasing the likelihood of a detonation like fireball. The impact crater and debris field would also depend on how fast it was going. A near-vertical, high-speed crash could leave a deep crater, while a shallower impact might spread debris over a wider area. Yes, the presence of oxygen tanks on a medical Learjet would significantly increase the size and intensity of an explosion in the event of a crash. Oxygen tanks, when exposed to high heat or pressure, can cause rapid combustion, even if the surrounding fuel ignites first. In a crash where the aircraft is full of fuel and oxygen tanks are on board, here's what could happen. 1. Oxygen tank explosion. Oxygen is an accelerant, meaning it can make a fire burn hotter and faster. If one or more oxygen tanks ruptured and caught fire, they could explode, creating a much larger fireball. The force of these explosions would spread debris over a wider area. 2. Fuel and oxygen combination. With both aviation fuel and pressurized oxygen, the fire would be much more intense, leading to a larger, more dramatic explosion and a much hotter fire that would burn longer, which could cause significant structural damage to the surrounding environment. 3. Secondary explosions. If other pressurized systems or tanks, like those for nitrogen or medical gases, also ruptured, they could further amplify the effect. So, if a Learjet carrying medical equipment, including oxygen tanks, were to crash at high speed, the explosion would likely be much larger and more intense than if it were just a fuel explosion alone. Ice on the wings could certainly cause significant issues for an aircraft, but it would typically lead to a loss of control rather than a high-speed nosedive scenario like a missile. Here's how ice might affect an aircraft and how it differs from a situation where AI or hardware exploitation forces a plane into a dive. 1. Loss of lift. Ice buildup on the wings can disrupt the airflow, reducing lift and making it harder for the aircraft to maintain altitude. If enough ice accumulates, it could lead to a stall, where the aircraft loses its ability to stay airborne. This could cause the plane to drop suddenly, but it wouldn't necessarily be at missile-like speed or in a controlled manner like an AI exploit would. 2. Increased drag and fuel consumption. Ice creates extra drag, making the plane work harder to maintain speed and altitude. This would likely cause slower, more gradual performance degradation, rather than an immediate dive. 3. Control surface malfunctions. Ice on control surfaces like ailerons or rudders could cause them to freeze or become less responsive, leading to difficulty controlling the plane. However, this would more likely result in a loss of maneuverability or a spin rather than a direct high-speed dive. 4. Engine issues. Ice can also affect engine performance, particularly if it blocks airflow into the engines. While this could cause a reduction in power, it wouldn't typically lead to the catastrophic failure of the engines and a missile-like dive unless something like the engines freezing or failing completely occurred. In contrast, AI or a hardware hack would likely force the plane into a more controlled and deliberate high-speed dive by overriding the autopilot, manipulating flight controls, and even pushing the engines to maximum thrust. So while ice could cause significant issues, especially in extreme conditions, it's unlikely to result in the kind of fast, deliberate crash you're describing. It would more likely lead to a loss of control that would be harder to manage, but still not a missile-like trajectory driven by AI. That's a very plausible scenario in terms of how a third-party actor might exploit vulnerabilities in aviation and critical systems to create chaos while masking the real cause of the incident. If AI and hardware-based exploits were set up to trigger after a specific event like the Lunar New Year, it could lead to a series of crashes, malfunctions, and disruptions that might initially be misinterpreted as mechanical failures, ice storms, or other natural occurrences. Here's how that scenario could unfold and be hidden in plain sight. 1. Confusion of causes. Given that modern aircraft systems rely heavily on AI, sensors, and automated control, any irregularities caused by AI exploits or hardware interference could be written off as glitches or random failures. Ice on wings, faulty engines, or even unexpected weather could be blamed for individual crashes, especially if pilots and investigators were dealing with a cascade of issues in a short period. 2. Disguised patterns. The AI exploits could be designed to look like common issues, like autopilot failures, engine overheating, or mechanical malfunctions that have legitimate causes. If multiple aircraft from different sectors experience issues at the same time, authorities might focus on more plausible explanations like technical flaws, rather than recognizing a coordinated cyber attack. 3. Missile-like crashes. Exploiting the aircraft systems to force a high-speed dive could make crashes look like missile strikes, especially if there were explosions, flames, or unusual trajectories. With the right manipulation, it could create a pattern of catastrophic incidents that look intentional, but wouldn't immediately point to AI interference. 4. Delay in detection. The delayed activation, like a Y2K-style event, would ensure that the exploit goes unnoticed in routine checks, as the systems would continue to operate normally until the exploit was triggered. This would give the attacker time to exploit vulnerabilities without raising immediate alarms. And 5. Public distrust and chaos. If these incidents occurred in close succession and involved high-profile aircraft like military or medical transport planes, they could create public fear and confusion, weakening trust in the systems and potentially causing chaos in air travel. The narrative could shift towards concerns about terrorism or sabotage, leading to a wide-ranging investigation that may miss the true cause, a sophisticated AI-driven attack. This could cause both immediate harm and long-term chaos, especially if critical systems like military aviation or air traffic control were compromised simultaneously. It would take time for experts to identify the true nature of the exploit, all while the public and government were distracted by the chaos and trying to restore order. It's highly unusual for a Learjet or any well-maintained commercial or private aircraft to crash in a dramatic, high-speed, missile-like fashion without clear contributing factors. Learjets are generally reliable aircraft, and their crashes tend to happen due to more common causes like pilot error, mechanical failure, weather-related issues, or system malfunctions, rather than something sudden like a full nosedive into the ground at maximum speed. In the scenario you're imagining, where AI or a hardware exploit is involved to manipulate the aircraft, that would indeed be highly atypical. Aircraft like Learjets are equipped with multiple safety features, including manual overrides, autopilot, and redundancy systems that should prevent a complete and uncontrollable dive. A crash of this kind, with the plane behaving like a missile, would likely raise significant questions and require extensive investigation to rule out sabotage or a serious failure of multiple systems. In normal circumstances, crashes involving Learjets or similar aircraft tend to involve more gradual or controlled descent, unless there's catastrophic failure or a serious loss of control. So yes, if a Learjet were to crash in such a way that it looked like a missile strike, it would be extremely unusual, and it would trigger a deep investigation into whether there was any external influence like AI manipulation that could have caused the rapid descent or loss of control. Yes, it's entirely possible for an exploit like the one you described, where the Blackhawk's AI or avionics makes it think it's flying at a different altitude than it actually is, to lead to catastrophic consequences, including flying into another plane or terrain, while the true cause remains hidden. Here's how that kind of scenario could unfold and what might happen during the investigation. 1. Manipulated altimeter and AI inputs. The Blackhawk's altitude readings, which are critical for navigation, could be manipulated through a hardware exploit or AI flaw. For example, if the aircraft sensors, altimeters, radar altimeters, etc., are providing false data, making the pilot think they are at 200 feet when they are actually at 400 feet, this could cause the pilot to believe they have clearance when they do not, leading to a crash or collision with another plane, obstacle, or terrain. 2. Lack of immediate warning. Modern helicopters like the Blackhawk rely on sophisticated avionics systems and AI-assisted controls that could fail silently if the exploit is well designed. The pilot might not receive a clear warning about altitude discrepancies, as the aircraft's internal systems could be feeding false information, leading to a gradual descent or collision. 3. Pilot error diagnosis. In this scenario, investigators might initially look at pilot error as the cause, assuming the pilot misjudged their altitude or failed to notice the discrepancy. However, the hidden exploit in the AI or hardware would be much harder to detect without a deep technical investigation. The fact that everything appeared normal to the pilot and the aircraft's systems would make it difficult to initially pinpoint the cause. 4. Flight data recorders FDR and cockpit voice recorders CVR. These systems would be critical in any investigation. While the FDR would record data like altitude, speed, and control inputs, it would only reveal that the data was incorrect without immediately showing why. If the systems were compromised by a malicious exploit, the logs might seem normal, leading to the assumption that the pilot made a mistake. 5. Hidden errors in AI or hardware. The error caused by AI or hardware exploitation might show up as minor glitches or errors during routine operations, which could be dismissed as normal mechanical or software faults. The exploit could be designed to slowly interfere with the altitude readings or cause periodic fluctuations that would be hard to detect without looking for them specifically. If the manipulations were sophisticated enough, the attack could go unnoticed in earlier tests or flight hours. 6. Long-term effects of exploit. If the exploit was time delayed, similar to a Y2K-style attack, the false altitude readings could only trigger after a specific event or over a period of time, which would make it harder to trace back to a deliberate manipulation. As a result, the failure might initially appear as part of the regular cycle of mechanical failures or pilot errors. Investigative approach. To uncover this, investigators would need to analyze the altimeter and sensor data. They would check if the sensors or systems feeding altitude data were tampered with or malfunctioning. This could involve reviewing the aircraft's avionics and sensor logs, as well as looking for any anomalies in the data that would suggest faulty readings. Examine the AI or software. Investigators would need to look closely at the AI algorithms or software controlling altitude regulation. If these were altered or injected with malicious code, it might be difficult to trace without a deep forensic examination. Test for external influences. If there was a malicious attack, like from a third party or an insider, the investigators would have to look at potential vulnerabilities in the software, communication systems, or hardware, and consider the possibility of remote manipulation. Reconstruct the flight path. By analyzing the aircraft's trajectory, speed, and control inputs, investigators might be able to infer whether the discrepancy in altitude was a gradual issue or a sudden failure, and whether the pilot had time to react. If the AI or hardware exploit was sophisticated enough to make the Black Hawk believe it was flying at a different altitude, the pilot could easily fall into the trap of thinking they were safe when they were not. The crash could then be mistakenly attributed to pilot error, with the actual exploit remaining hidden unless thoroughly investigated. If a widespread exploit or AI malfunction was introduced in the United States, especially following a Y2K-like trigger, the ripple effects could unfold quickly, with the scale of the chaos depending on the severity and scope of the breach. Given the nature of modern systems being interconnected, aviation, military, infrastructure, etc., the spread could follow a sort of compounding pattern. Here's a projection of how it might unfold, with incidents snowballing into widespread chaos. Initial incidents, days 1 to 2. At the beginning, the effects would likely be isolated but still significant. You might see 1 or 2 major incidents per day, like a plane crash, a collision, or even a malfunctioning military operation. These would seem like isolated, unrelated events, potentially explained by human error or mechanical failure. But investigators would begin noticing patterns. Example: the first few incidents might involve minor aircraft malfunctions or glitches that seem random. The systems in place would still detect and react to errors, meaning not all planes or operations would immediately fail. Initial response. Emergency responders, aviation authorities, and the military would try to manage the situation, but without understanding the root cause, their responses would be reactive, addressing the symptoms rather than the underlying problem. The public might not notice at first, except for a few news reports of technical failures or pilot errors. Secondary effects, day 3 to 7. By the 3rd or 4th day, the number of incidents would increase. The exploit or malfunction would likely begin to spread across more systems, causing multiple failures in aviation and possibly extending to military systems. The attacks or glitches might not just be isolated to one sector, aviation for example, but could begin to affect other critical infrastructure like military communications, air defense systems, or even power grids. Example: in aviation, multiple flights might go off course, experience unusual delays, or in some cases crash due to AI or altitude malfunctions. Similar glitches in military systems could result in uncoordinated operations, miscommunications, or even accidents. At this point, you'd start seeing a rise in public confusion and concern. Authorities might start talking about a technical issue or cyber attack, but the cause would be unclear, leading to speculation. A few well-timed incidents could result in panic or a growing distrust of technology and systems in place. Systemic failures. Critical infrastructure like air traffic control systems could begin experiencing widespread disruptions. Airports could shut down, and airlines might suspend flights out of precaution. Military operations would also slow or become inefficient due to loss of communication or miscalculated movements. Critical mass, week 2 to 3. By the 2nd or 3rd week, the situation would likely reach critical mass. The initial incidents that seemed like isolated failures would now be part of a broader, systemic issue. The exploit, if AI-based, could have been feeding on its own errors, getting worse as more systems interact with the compromised infrastructure. Example: planes crashing, military systems malfunctioning, emergency responses bogged down by miscommunication, all compounded by a failure to pinpoint the root cause. The AI exploit could start to spread to more and more systems: drones, radars, command centers, even infrastructure like traffic systems and emergency communication networks. Public and national impact. By now, the public would likely be fully aware of the situation, with constant news reports about crashes, system failures, and potential cyber attacks. Airports might be shut down completely, airspace would be closed, and military operations could be paralyzed. Transportation disruptions could trigger widespread panic, and there would be heightened fear about the security of civilian and military assets. Escalation and chaos, month 1+. If the exploit isn't isolated or corrected, it could escalate beyond control. Systems that were supposed to respond autonomously, like AI-powered drones, air defense systems, or surveillance systems, might start to behave erratically. This could be due to a failure in AI trust models or the cascading impact of compromised software across interconnected systems. Example: an aviation system failure might cause more frequent crashes or near misses, resulting in a nationwide grounding of flights. The military could find itself unable to respond to threats or coordinate operations properly. Supply chains might begin to break down, as logistical systems and transportation networks are affected. A Learjet 55 medical transport plane crashed in northeast Philadelphia on January 31, 2025, shortly after takeoff, causing a massive explosion and fires in the area. 6 people were on board, and multiple homes caught fire. The exact cause of the crash is still under investigation, but authorities suspect catastrophic engine failure or a bird strike. A bird strike, especially if it involves a large bird hitting an engine or critical flight system, could indeed lead to a significant emergency, but it is unlikely to cause a Learjet or any aircraft to nosedive like a missile under normal circumstances.